A lot of people wrongly believe that the inflation crisis is almost over, that we are at the end. And this is a very dangerous mistake because we're just at the beginning, and that's what I'm gonna show you in this video. Now, what you need to understand, and here's an example from the 70s, inflation crises do not just go away by raising interest rates. That's a myth. And we saw it in the 70s. We had 4 peaks, we had 1 inflation warning and 3 inflation shocks. So interest rates went up, inflation came a little bit down, and then it came back again. That's not how you fight inflation. And unfortunately, central banks still believe, and many people still believe, that just interest rate policies will get rid of inflation. It's not the case. What I want to show you is, so that you kind of know where we are right now, let's take the 1970s inflation crisis and let's just assume that we are here. We had the first shock, and the same way as people got excited in 1972, by the way, in 1972, as today, the S&P 500 made a new all-time high. Because people were excited, inflation is over, interest rates were coming down way more, and everybody was running into the stock market except one person, Warren Buffett. Warren Buffett was very cautious. He kept a lot of liquidity, a lot of cash, because he knew what was coming, the second inflation shock. And that's the one that you have to prepare for, it because that one is very nasty. And I have another video that explains what happened there and how you approach this. But what's very important is to understand we had even a third inflation shock, or a fourth peak, if you see that pattern. And that's very important to understand. Inflation crises have very often this escalating wave pattern, or roller coaster pattern, as I often call it. And that's the same thing that I anticipate is going to happen again. Let's just take a look at this from a different perspective. What did the Federal Reserve do back then? Well, we had the first interest rate increase was similar to today, 475 basis points. Then inflation came back. In the second one, they increased interest rates by 780. And then in the third one, you remember in the period 77 to 80, interest rates crossed the 20% mark. So we had 1,735 basis points of interest rates going up. But it all didn't help, because there's a simple reason for this. Central banks can produce inflation. They can create it with ultra-loose policies, but they cannot get rid of it. And that's the big illusion. It's not that easy that you just raise interest rates and inflation goes away. All you do with an interest rate hike is that you produce a recession. And in that recession, companies are forced to bring prices down, whether they want it or not. But it comes back because there is a big problem, an underlying problem. And that's what I try to explain on this chart. First of all, imagine inflation is something like toothpaste. You squeeze on the tube and the whole stuff comes out. There's no way that you can easily get it back into the tube. And it definitely doesn't work that you just push the form of the tube in the original position and that would suck in the toothpaste. It's not gonna work. And if we translate that into the economy, and that's very important, and I understood that only after studying Venezuela, Colombia, and many other inflation crises around the world, what happens with ultra-loose monetary policies is that they totally change the economy. So we get a completely different new reality. And what is this new reality? Well, it's easy to make good investments because interest rates are so low. That's one point. Therefore, also, productivity is not that much of a focus from companies because they're not pushed hard enough to work on productivity. And we get a lot of inefficiencies that are not addressed. And we get these zombie companies that can just survive with these low interest rates. And that's a new reality that you have to deal with, because otherwise inflation will become chronic and systemic, like we have seen in some European countries during the 70s. Then they had a very long period of high inflation rates. So we have to understand there is a new reality, and that new reality needs different measures to bring inflation down. And in a nutshell, what you need to do is you need to work on resetting the economy. You have to increase productivity. You have to, as a government, you have to provide incentives to invest and to make companies more efficient again. And you also need to push for innovations. And let me explain to you in the 1980s example again. Early 1980s was the last inflation shock. And you will ask, why was that the last one? Right? The central banks did exactly the same. They raised interest rates and stopped the economy, recession, inflation came down. But why did inflation not go up again? Because we had back then a new reality. We had Reaganomics. Reaganomics was lower taxes, deregulation, more competition. And with that, productivity went up, inefficiencies went away. And also we had, with the lower taxes, that was a helpful push for the companies, because at the end of the day, the companies need to make a profit margin. And if inflation is high, they just need to raise the cost of the goods that they sell or the services further and further. So what you need to create is this situation that costs come down through lower taxes, through lower regulations, through more competitions in some cases, and through innovation. And then you get this push for lower inflation. Now, in the early 1980s, the innovation part was very important to bring inflation down. You remember that was the time when big companies came like Apple, when the PC was starting and computers were starting to spread around and make all functions much easier. WordPerfect, the first word processing software, was introduced. Just think about the administrative side of a big company. All of a sudden, you don't have typewriters anymore. You can use text again. You can save it. You can reuse it. You can send one message to many people, the same letter. You can just change it a little bit. You don't have to retype it. These simple improvements created a big productivity boost. If you look at the productivity numbers of the 80s versus the 70s, you see that. Deregulation helped to bring costs down. You remember back then, that was the time in the 80s when, for example, discount brokers started to make their mark in the financial brokerage industry. Before, one transaction was 3%, so buying 3% of a stock and selling 3%. Then all of a sudden, big direct brokers, low-cost brokers came into the market and brought these prices down. There was competition among the airlines. And all of a sudden, because prices could be easier set by the companies, there were less regulations. Or in the insurance industry, the same. Warren Buffett's acquisition of was actually very interesting, of Geico in 1976 is a good example. Back then, you had to ask for regulatory approval if you want to raise rates. And not only you had to do that in every state. So what happened here, that inflation went down and never came back, was we had a new reality. We had more productivity, more competition. We had more focus on fighting inefficiencies, bringing costs down, and we had the innovation. And one point I didn't mention yet was globalization. Some aspects of the economic system, some parts, were basically given to other countries who could produce, manufacture these goods at a lower price. And that brought inflation down. So that's very important to understand. So as long as you don't see the government and the central banks talking about productivity, innovation, deregulation, you will not see an end of the inflation crisis. You will see this roller coaster pattern, and hopefully it doesn't spiral out of control as it did in Venezuela. Venezuela, same pattern, 2 or 3 hikes, and then boom, it went out of control. So that's very important to understand. So what does that mean for you? I highly recommend to my clients that you get familiar with the 1970s inflation crisis and this roller coaster. You need to anticipate. So you should know today exactly whether you're an investor, a small business manager, or a CEO of a big company. You should know exactly how is the next inflation shock impacting you, and what do you do once it arrives. If you don't know that, it will be too late. You need to know now. You need to do these stress testing. You need to understand how inflation works. And there are 2 very important factors for this. One is inflation mechanics and one is inflation dynamics. The inflation mechanics helps you understand how inflation will impact your industry, your industrial structure, and inflation dynamics will help you to understand inflation over time. That's very important. You need to stress test your company, or if you're an investor, your portfolio, you need to stress test it for this second inflation shock. Take the one from 73, 74 and just rerun it for today. And the last one is, look at Warren Buffett. Warren Buffett there are 2 people that I highly admire for their inflation management capabilities. One was Hugo Stinnes, who became the richest German in the hyperinflation period in Germany, and the other one is Warren Buffett in the 1970s. It was just brilliant how he managed the inflation risk, and I'm in the process of finishing a tutorial on Warren Buffett. It's called Warren Buffett Decoded, and we look very much into detail to explain how Warren Buffett, what he did back then in the 70s, that he was so successful. So however you want to prepare, you can prepare with me, you can read my books. In 2016, I published a book, The Return of High Inflation, that told you everything that we are experiencing right now. The second part is not a new book. It's an online class. It's called The Ugly World of Tomorrow. A lot of my CEO clients basically said, don't write another 366-page book, even though it was brilliant. Please make a video out of it. It's much easier for us. So I heard you, and you can download this on my online class. There's also the Warren Buffett class that I will offer, and there is a very detailed advanced inflation management, preparing for the world of tomorrow. That's an 11-hour program that I put together. It's based on the workshops that I do with some of the top players in the world. For the first time, it's available as an online class, or just take anybody else who knows inflation, but you need to prepare. Please prepare for the second inflation shock. Prepare for a much longer inflation period, because if you don't and it hits you, it will be ugly. Thank you very much. And if you have any questions, contact me.